Okay, hello everyone. We wanted to talk about the IAM roles for service account and how this works. The last week we had proof of concept and we tried to figure out how this could potentially work within our company. So let me quickly share a small demo and a presentation, and then I hope everyone has a bit better understanding how this works. Let me share my screen first. Present. Okay. So as I said, we wanted to talk about the IAM rules for service accounts. For the short naming, it's called IRSA. That's what you sometimes read on blog posts and stuff like that, because this is a really, really long name. To give you a bit background about this, there was like the kickoff started in 2018 for this IAM roles for service accounts. There was in the roadmap for EKS, there was an issue tracked. This was just like heavily demanded from the community. Basically, they were just like trying for trying to find a good solution which fits into EKS, and they were just like coming up with an approach. So before it was just like only useful when you just, if you wanted to have some IAM roles, basically you just had to stick with the community projects. There were just like some projects already available, and but AWS was not really like convinced that this is just going in the right way, so they just wanted to come up with a own solution. Introduced was it in September 2019 as a general availability, and at least from the blog post. So they just like wrote something about that they have this now, this feature in EKS, and you can just use it natively. And yeah, to just talk about a bit the difference. So here at Giantstorm, we are using KIAM, and maybe not all of you are just familiar with like how KIAM works basically. KIAM is like this client server setup, where you basically have a client running on each worker, and then you have on the KIAM server is basically located on the master nodes, and whenever your pod wants to use an IAM role, you basically intercept the metadata endpoint and just like bypass it to the KIAM server, and the KIAM server will figure out based on the annotation from the pod level to assume the correct role. And you have basically two daemon sets which are running, as I said, and the encrypted gRPC communication is is a necessary thing in order to communicate between a KIAM agent and a KIAM server. So this also means that you have to ensure that the encryption works with the certificate, which is provided in our setup from the cert manager. And to talk about the IRSA solution, this is a bit different. So instead of you having the annotation based on the pod level, you just set an annotation on the service account. And whenever you create a pod, there is a pod identity webhook from EKS provided, which mutates the pod in order to call AWS. And basically, you can think of like it's providing projected volume. This is something where you can provide config maps or secrets or anything like that. And you would just like, the pod is basically, there's projected volume added, and you also get environments flags or environments basically set on the pod level, where you have some information like what to assume, which role, and stuff like that. But we are just looking on this later a bit. So the OpenID Connect is required to basically verify those JOT tokens. So basically what Kubernetes does is when you have these projected volumes, you have a JOT token, which is sent to validate, this gets validated against the, or from the OpenID Connect. So it's just like the provider basically verifies if this, key is coming from Kubernetes is can be trusted, and if it can just like gets this IAM credentials basically. And as I said, you have this mutating webhook which injects the environment variables and adds this projected volume. To give you a bit an overview about the setup, so you first have to, or let me rephrase it. AWS basically says the best way how you can use this IRSA in non-running EKS clusters, you have to set up an S3 bucket, which has this information about the keys, which is just like, I will just talk about this later. And you have the OpenID configuration inside the well-known directory. So you have to provide this as a public read endpoint so that Kubernetes basically, or like your Kubernetes cluster can talk with the S3 bucket basically. So there's not real deep information inside, but the OpenID configuration is a bit interesting. I will talk about this later. As I said, the OpenID configuration looks like this. This is just like an example. So you have the issuer, which is your S3 bucket. You have the JWKS URI. This is important because there you just like provide the endpoint for the keys in order to validate your key against the accepted keys. This is just like the location of your keys basically. And then you see on the last lines basically just talks about the claim supported, which is like the sub is important to allow it because the sub is used inside the JOT token from the service account basically. And this needs to be enabled basically, because then it just looks at it if this specific sub can assume this role, if it's just granted or not. Then you have the identity provider, which you have to set up with the audience of the STS to assume role. Nothing special, but you have to just like provide here also your the OIDC provider with the bucket name basically. And if you have this, then you can also set up an IAM role. The IAM role is basically then with the trusted entity. As I said, there you also see the conditions, which is like the condition for which service account can assume this role specifically. And the trusted entity has to match with the S3 bucket from what you did set up before, basically. Then you have to set up also the Kube API flags. The service account key file, you have to set it twice, because the reason why you have this twice is we already use a service account key file to sign service accounts. If you would just remove this one, like the old one, then all the service accounts which were just generated before would not work anymore. That's the reason why you have to bypass a second one. And this one is with the signed with the OID issuer. And this one has to match with your configuration on the S3 bucket level. So it has to be the same keys, basically, in order that AWS allows to assume roles. And then you have the service account signing key, which has to stick with the OIDC, as I said. And then you have to bypass the service account issuer, which is your bucket, basically, and the API audiences to say, okay, you want to use assume roles from Amazon. You can just add multiple into it if you want, but the advantage of just providing this, just to mention it, is basically you can also be, you don't have to run your cluster basically inside Kubernetes, inside AWS, because you could just also use it in let's say in a data center. So when you just like want to move on, like if you want to migrate from a former data center to AWS, you could just use it. And then you could just like allow yourself basically those IAM roles. You can also use the IAM roles in another cluster account. You don't have to use it in the same account as you would just have it in your Kubernetes cluster. Doesn't have to run in the same account basically to assume those roles. So it's just like a bit open about that. And then, as I said, you have these JOT tokens from Kubernetes. This is just basically how it looks like. You have some information inside. You just need this assume role with web identity, and you have to just like say, okay, what your sub here is basically the S3 access. So this is like the token which you would see on the inside the pod when you just like look into the var secrets directory, and you would just like look into the JOT token basically to see what has been assumed or what's trying to assume basically. And yeah, this is a bit a diagram how this works. So basically, you have the app which says, okay, give me some credentials. Here's my JOT. This one is in the header, so it just looks into the key ID, and if it's just knows this key ID or not, it just looks into the open IT configuration. Basically, as I said, there is this URI for the JWKS, which is just like the public keys, and then it tries to say, okay, I know this, and I just want to validate this, and here, those policies are okay, and then you just get back the SDS token from IAM, basically. So this is just how the workflow in a overview is working. And to give you a bit a demo, basically, this is maybe more interesting. So I'm currently running in a cluster where we already set up this. So we have the pod identity webhook, which is the mutator for those creating pods. And we could just try to modify the external DNS in order to just like use this, to use the IAM roles for service accounts. So right now, the external DNS is using our setup. So it has this init container, fetch the security credentials, and grab the role, and we also have the annotation here set. This is just something which is, I think, from KIAM. And yeah, let's try to break it. So first of all, we just want to check if the external DNS is working. So I guess it's fine. It's just tries to fetch all the records and tries to understand if everything is up to date. This seems to be the case. So what can we do? So first of all, we could just try to edit the deployment from external DNS. We could just try to move the remove everything what we think is not necessary anymore. So let's try to remove the annotation, because this is not necessary anymore. As I said, the service account uses the annotation inside inside the service account, and we just need to strip also of the init container, because I don't see a reason why we should have this anymore. So, okay. So now I would expect that this thing, just make it a bit bigger for you. Yeah, I would expect that this thing is breaking now because it just cannot fetch anything anymore. So here, as you see, the has an issue with the hosted zone and says, okay, I don't have any permissions anymore. Just please help me. And we do that by just like adding the service account for the external DNS part. Service account. So what we need to do here is, as I said, we have to just like inject something annotation, and we just like provide this. So this is something which I prepared before. It's basically an IAM role with the exact same roles as we had before, but just a different IAM role. And it has this trust and entity to that specific here, to this specific service account. So let's try to do that. And of course, since the pod identity webhook is just like only watching on new creates, we have to restart the pod so that in order that it just injects this new information inside the pod of external DNS. So just try to delete the pod. And yeah, hopefully it will be.
Quick question on the annotation.
Yes.
The name of the annotation was something like manage giant
Yeah.
swarm something. How does the webhook know that this is like what the webhook is interested in?
Yeah. So inside the webhook, you can just say the annotation prefix in order to just like make this work. So you can just use any. I mean, it was using before the EKS dot something, but I just wanted to try it out with a different annotation prefix.
Cool.
So I think our pod has been restarted, and we can just try to describe the pod. So what you see is now what I mentioned earlier is like you have those environments. One is the AWS role-on, which is just like the one which you're trying to get permissions, and the other one is just basically the location where the JOT token lies. And you see basically here you have a new volume. This is a projected volume. And the token expiration is also something interesting. So you can set the token expiration based on the service account. You can set an additional annotation, but if you don't set it, it will be automatically set. So this token expiration is just like set from Kubernetes, and yeah, once this is just like expired, it just refreshes it. It just creates a new one basically for you. So you don't have to think about this, because usually what you have when you just create service accounts, there is no expiration basically. Okay, so now we have this.
A question, which token is in the projected volume? Is that the JWT token in there?
This is a JOT token from Kubernetes. Yeah, we can just look at it. I can just try to go into the pod, and we can just identify it. So I just want to ensure that external DNS is working again. So you can just see, okay, it just tries to use the service account token, and then everything is fine. So now you have basically a working external DNS with the service account, with the IAM roles for service accounts, basically. And what Tim mentioned is we wanted to identify what's in there, and we can do that, I hope. Oh, shit. Okay, so we inside the pod, and we can just do this where the var run and then secrets, and there is one EKS Amazon.com service account. This is something like from our pod identity webhook, and the other one, what you see from Kubernetes.io, is the default one. So remember, I talked about this service account key files where you just have two of those, right? One is just like the new one with the sign from the OIDC issuer, and the other one is the legacy service account issuer. That's the difference between. So you can just have multiple tokens inside. You don't have to use the same one. So it can be you can have multiple. You could also have a service account, if this would work at some point, a service account with credentials for, I don't know, Google or whatever you want, right? So you just only have to just set the API flags in Kubernetes in order to make that work. So, and yeah, Sim said he wanted to just look at the token. So this is the token. This is a JOT token. But usually you wouldn't, as a human, you wouldn't understand it, right? So you just need to have something in place. So usually what I do is there's this page called JSON Web Tokens, and you can just like pass into what you want, right? And you see the coding. So, and like what's in there is basically the information provided from Kubernetes. So it has the sub, right? Service account, external DNS. And yeah, the issuer is here located, and you basically want to just like, the audience is STS Amazon.com, and you want to have a token for that. And in order to just use it, you will just send it to Amazon. And what you don't see basically is inside the SDK. So remember I talked about that, yeah, this is something coming from the header, and you just send this information, but where does it just like coming from? Who's just sending this stuff? And the reason is just like this, in order to use this stuff, you just need to have the SDK, any SDK from Amazon, which can be just Python or Go or whatever, but it needs to be supported. So it just does this under the hood whenever you just like use the SDK, basically. It just knows, okay, I need to send this data to, to this endpoint, and then I can just like use those credentials. And this is just like hide it in the SDK, basically. Okay. Any questions?
I have a question about the volume that you said that had that expiration.
Yeah.
When it expires, is the pod rebooted somehow, or is it just not?
It's not rebooted. It's just like injected, and the the information is also like I don't know like how it's working underneath the SDK, but I think it just detects if it's just like been refreshed, and it has to just refresh it.
What is preventing any pod within Kubernetes to set the service account for themselves?
What? Say again?
you set up a service account for your application, right? And you have like credentials and you're kind of authorized to do that. But then like Tim comes along and wants to run a pod with the same thing because like Tim wants to do nasty stuff. And what is preventing me from using the service account that you set up for my pod?
Yeah, so if you would just set up a service account and you wanted to just use the same role, right? It would not work because the trust identity is basically just only set with the specific service account what you just like entered there. So you just like say, I want to have a trust identity between a specific service account. But if you just know the specific service account and you would just want to use those roles, you can just do it. Nothing would just stop you basically. If it's just like already existing, then you could just do. But I think it's currently also possible in KIAM. So if you would just know which annotation you have to set in order to just get those permissions, you could just do that easily. So I think what AWS thinks is basically that you just like have this cluster as a layer of security already. So there is no difference between for them. Like, I mean, you can just specify it via namespace basically. So you have to just like say also those specific namespace with the service account, but I think there's no granularity between this anymore. So you just like if your pod is running in the same namespace, then you would just probably easy to fetch those IAM roles for yourself.
It probably you need probably a bit more configuration with RBAC to actually limit access to specific. Or limit. You have to allow. So instead of, because one thing that I noticed with Kubernetes is that a lot of RBAC definitions, you just end up with some stars in there because it's a lot easier to just provide access.
Also, the main difference I see here is that on KIAM, you basically say the master can assume any role that you want to define. But in here, you need to be more specific, like I want to have this role for this specific service account in this namespace.
Exactly. So you have to just think about before you're just creating IAM roles, you have to just say, okay, those are just like trusted by specific service account you wanted to. So the good part about that is that you can run both. So you don't just need one or the other. So you can just have two things. But yeah, I mean, the more you just run, the more the complexity just like rises up. So the thing is like, or the problematic thing is that you just actually have to somehow, in order to make it, let me rephrase it. In order to make it quite easy for customer, you have to just use the SDK. You can just do it without the SDK, but then it's getting more and more complicated because then you have to just run some scripts which understands like how to just like, yeah, use a call and.
I'm quite positive that if somebody makes an application that wants to talk to AWS is going to use the SDK. You don't want to start like curling different APIs. It's hell. But yeah. It's a little bit more, I would say, tied to the implementation, while KIAM is mostly transparent in that way.
And also, like, one thing to mention is what I said before is like you have the possibility to assume roles wherever you want. So basically, if you would just set up the Kube API flags and you already have the OIDC implementation running on AWS, you could just simply try to assume IAM roles from a totally different cluster. So there could be just like some benefits about like if you would just have running inside a old-fashioned data center and you want to migrate to AWS, you can do it with that. Or you can just like also think about you want to assume a role in a different account. So this is also possible. So I don't know if this really works with KIAM, but I guess there were just like more thoughts into this about from AWS what you can actually do with this approach. And the different additional thing is you can also inject this pod identity webhook implementation also in your admission controller. So you don't have to run this. So you could just try to limit the chain of webhooks, just like to say, okay, I use this code, what they implemented, and just use it in my own already existing admission controller. One thing which I noticed is like a bit problematic if you just like restart pods at the same time. So if you would just restart, let's say you restart the external DNS pod at the same time with the pod identity webhook, then you would just get into troubles because you get not, you don't see this event that a new pod has been created because your pod already just restarts. So it will not just like mutate anything. So you have to be a bit careful about like restarting the pod basically, because it's just like it's necessary in order to run, because it needs to see the events when something gets created to inject things. But yeah, this is just like a minor detail.
2 webhook pods, right?
Yeah, I just played around with it in order to just like fix it a bit, like pod disruption budget and setting like things like that. But we already have this. Also, we have these problems right now with the admission controller. Whenever the admission controller restarts, it will not see anything, and you can just basically inject whatever you want, and there's nothing which just like stops you, because it's not prevented by the admission controller. Oh yeah.
And do you think, like, is it necessary to have one IDC provider per worker cluster, or can we have like one provider for the whole management cluster?
Yeah, so the thing is like it's a good question, because
I think that the workload clusters are sometimes run in different AWS accounts. Is that relevant for the IAM roles?
Exactly. So you have to run it in the same account, basically, where you just try to assume IAM roles. But you could just like have it a bit simpler, because you just like the only thing is like what you then have, like you have to provide the generated key basically in each Kubernetes cluster. This might be a bit problematic, but maybe not. Like if just like customer are just like fine with it, and they just like creating, let's say, thousands clusters, and they say as an organization we trust this, and there shouldn't be any reason why we just create separate keys for, let's say, production or staging or whatever. It's fine, and you still have to set on the IAM role the bucket basically for the assumption. So I think it is possible to do that, to just like do it a bit, limiting the complexity of setting up this stuff. But as I said, I don't know, like if the customer doesn't feel like really confident with that, then we have to set up for each cluster.
I'm just wondering because in the end, all certificates tend to expire somehow, and then we need to renew these certificates, and then we need to, I don't know, somehow restart or update the webhook and mission controller in all the tenant clusters, just to make sure that if we somehow do this, we should think that this is completely transparent, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything that's manual like this, at the beginning, it's not really an issue, but then it becomes an issue in the future.
Yeah.
I mean, personally, I think I like this implementation more.
Mm-hmm.
What I don't know, it's like my fear is having to maintain both things.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's my only hesitation.
We shouldn't be maintaining two things at the same time. It should just be for the during the transition. Yeah? So basically, if we were to release it, let's say with version 14 will have both. But then in 15, we should just have one.
Yes, but even then, what are we going to upload KIAM to the managed app team? Or are we going to basically say we don't support this anymore?
My understanding with KIAM was it's just used by our applications at the moment. No? Okay, then it means yeah.
Because at least Shutterstock and Adidas are using it.
Yeah. Then it's something that we have to take into account. To me, it does seem that there is a lot of work to get it up and running with the automation that we need, because we do have to change a few things in there. We have to generate additional things. So we, as a next step, I think we should define the list of tasks that we would have to do from an implementation point of view, and really have a discussion how we should move forward with this. And also evaluate the customer impact. If the customer uses it at the moment and the migration is not transparent to them, yeah. Because they would also have to set up those roles that they attach to the service accounts, and if it's up to the customer to the migration, then it's not just version 14 and then in version 15 it's gone. It's gonna take longer than that.
I mean, what this would allow us to do is, if KIAM is problematic, like maybe in the past, right? It was really noisy, I would say. Maybe if like in 60% of the clusters we don't need KIAM at all, right? Then KIAM would not be installed in there. And it could be like an optional application, right? But maybe there are some customers that have already taken it for granted because we said that we are providing it and they are using it.
Yeah.
I mean, the benefit of that would be just like we don't have to. I mean, we could just like get rid of the cert manager and KIAM. So it's just like also the dependency chain. What KIAM just needs is also like then not necessary anymore. So we could just really think about like having KIAM as an optional app and not a necessary app. Same for cert manager. I mean, as far as I know, it's just like the only thing which we really need for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would be interested if customer just really wants to just have if they just like would be okay with the setting up once for each installation. So like for each account, basically for each AWS account, we create those S3 bucket and the OIDC provider, because then we could just use maybe, I don't know, we don't have to even do it. We could just ask maybe the team who's just like in charge of like setting up once for the account this setup, and then we could just try to implement this from our side for the API flags and stuff like that. Because the service account is not doing anything as long as you just don't set any annotation, and it will, even though it will not just like use it. I'm not quite sure if you just set both like KIAM and, I mean, you have to switch it at some point, but yeah, it would not do anything right now. So if you would just set up this stuff, as long as you don't use the service account with the annotation, it will not do anything.
One question, Nick. So how does EKS do it? Do they create those things for each cluster, or?
Yeah, a good question. I don't know. Like, I haven't tried EKS. Maybe Tim knows a bit about that. I just like only see that they're just doing it on the like, if you just set it up, then it's automatically set up for you. So,
yeah, I would guess then it would be per cluster if they just do it. Yeah.
But they have a different, I think they don't use an S3 bucket. They have a real OIDC provider in the background with EKS something. So I don't know like how this works there. I mean, the suggestion from AWS is just basically if you just use non-EKS clusters, you should use S3 bucket, but you could just also use your own OIDC connect provider. If you have one, you could just also use DEX or I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, there's plenty of options. And something, yeah, they said basically the easiest way to do that is using the S3 bucket. But I think there's also in the community, there's now, I think there's a plan for the OIDC discovery. This is a feature gate or something. I'm not quite sure about that, but basically, if I got this correct, Kube API can also provide an endpoint for you with the well-known OpenID configuration, stuff like that. So you don't have to rely on anything located somewhere else. But I'm really not sure. Like, this is not just like half knowledge about this. I'm not really sure about that. But they have something what they wanted to offer. But it's just becoming 120, in 120 it becomes beta or something. I don't know.
I think in IAM you can create like real OIDC providers.
Yeah.
So I think EKS is using them. Then the question is, okay, how do you configure that? And
yeah, it just only need the endpoint, the HTTPS endpoint, and you just need the CA thumbprint, so the cert authority thumbprint from this. And what you do for S3 is just like you get the CA thumbprint from S3 Amazon.com or something, and you just like place it, and you just say, okay, here is my HTTPS endpoint, and that's it. But yeah, you can just choose whatever you want, so as an endpoint.
Would the IAM OIDC provider mean that we would not have to rotate the certificates in there as opposed to the S3 bucket? Because put in the S3 bucket, we would need to rotate manually, right?
So as I seen this from the script, there was no setup for like when this is not validated anymore. So there is no expiration. So you could just also set it up with that you don't have to rotate anything. But this is just like from a security perspective, is not really good. Yeah, because once you just leak those, right, you have a problem. So there should be I agree with you. There should be a mechanism where you just rotate. But right now, like how they suggested it, there was no mention about like you have to rotate keys and stuff like that. But you should, of course.
Would it make sense for us to actually also explore having an OIDC provider for this? And see what we...
it would make our world a bit easier, I think, definitely. The problem why I haven't picked up DEX, for instance, because we are just running DEX inside, I think, our clusters, is basically that it just has no valid certificate. So at least it's not getting trusted by AWS. So,
but also, like, if we have to deploy an OIDC provider for each cluster, right? I mean, where do we actually run that, right? Because it cannot run inside the cluster, otherwise we can end like in an egg
chicken
problem, right? So I think like the way that they are actually telling us to do it is because we don't actually need like any kind of EC2 instance in there. Like maybe you can also use, I think we talked about that, Nick, Lambda function, right? That actually returns you something. But in the end, S3 and S3 bucket is like going to be the cheapest option.
Yeah.
Also. So I think this kind of setup makes sense because it like the cost is really low and it's not going to impact our customers. And it's our life is much easier because if we want to deploy, I don't know, DEX or Keycloak or whatever, then we need like an additional server somewhere that we need to maintain and everything else. So if you want from my side, I would say I would like to talk to the SEs and check who is actually using KIAM and if they have some kind of super special setup or what software are they using KIAM with, so we can see what's the status in there. Because I don't know, maybe we can decide, okay, we are providing both things for 2 major releases, and as both things are running at the same time, they can just migrate anytime, right? Should be no issue. But just want to make sure how hard it would be if we want to take this direction.
Okay, I think you have today a sync, right?
Today,
the chapter is sync, right?
Today we have chapter sync, yeah.
Yeah. So you could start a conversation today on that. We do have a bit of a time limit, let's say, on this. That's why I would say during the planning today, let's also figure out what needs to, what we would need to do to put this in place. Maybe Nick, you could come up with an initial list of tasks that we would need to do. Because if we want to include it in V14, so that should go out in 2 weeks, at most 1 month, in case we have problems with the release. So we really have to see if it makes sense to put it in that one or not.
Yeah. Let me share my screen. So I already just wrote something down with Tim, like how the setup was done, basically what we have to provide, which templates and stuff like that. And we also have here basically the steps what you just need to do in order to make this just running. The question would be if this was enough or if we need to come up with something else.
So for me, it would be a bit more important, like what are the things that we would actually have to change with our setup? Yeah. So now you mentioned in this one what we actually did to get it running. But it would be, for us, for planning, it would be more useful to actually know what kind of things we would need to change in the AWS operator. I know you already mentioned there the templates and so on.
Yeah, maybe then I have to ask Tim, because there's my limit is a bit,
Because I do see, from what I've seen, from what you showed today, I think we need to change Cloud Aids config. We need to add additional automation in the AWS operator, because we need an extra bucket. If we do it per tenant cluster, if we don't do it, then it might be manual when the installation gets configured. But then we would actually have to check with the customers if they are fine. And I do know that Vodafone actually asked for this, like this setup. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, then is Vodafone already, did they start looking into this?
No, I think that their security team is a bit more hands-on on their environment, so they did a bit more checks in there and asked for things a bit more than the other customers. So there were two reasons why we started to look into this. It was Vodafone, but also because we had the issues with KIAM and we wanted to get rid of it.
Okay.
Do you want to take a short break? Because we do have the stand-up in a few minutes.
I will stop the recording.
Yeah.
Do you want to take a short break? Because we do have the stand-up in a few minutes.
I will stop the recording.